Why not? What could go wrong?
What could go
The
wrong
internet's forever.
on the internet?
Yeah.
Um, Speaking of the internet, are you still in school? Are you still doing
I
classes?
I am. Well, so I'm not doing any more classes. I just have one paper, one little paper to write, and then I'm done.
Yeehaw.
And it's different than the rest of all of school put together.
Yeah.
Yeah, writing the dissertation, the major project is really different than writing like other term papers or anything like that. Because your teacher is more like your editor, instead
Mhm.
of like, I'm gonna correct this and just like give you a grade. And then like that's the last time you ever look at anything on that paper, right?
Right.
Like when you turn it in. But now it's more like my academic advisor is like an editor saying, like, do you want to say this? Do you want to say it a different way? And then it's really up to you to
Right.
decide what you're going to do with it. But he'll make the corrections still, but it's a really different process, and it is slow. I need to figure out a way to get away and put some words on pages because
Mm.
there's a lot of blank ones ahead of me. But I'm hoping to get the bulk of the writing done by the end of the year, and then I can start with all the revisions and the reviews that are necessary afterwards. And so
And what's your main subject? What are you
it's
writing on?
yeah, I'm writing on uh, basically elevating communion in the non-denominational evangelical church context, which I exist in,
Yeah.
um, and what it looks like for a church to um, kind of pull from past traditions and say, like, no, we want this to be a central part of our service. What
Mm.
does that look like? Why are we doing it? And how do you introduce that into a congregation that doesn't? I mean, no one likes change. No one likes the uh,
Yeah.
anything that they're uncomfortable with. So it's like, why is
Like
communion
communion.
important? That's part of it. Why do
Yeah.
this thing that the church has been doing forever and do
Yeah.
it well and do it often?
Yeah.
And then hopefully once you're convinced of that, then it's, well, what does that look like? How does that look like in like a Calvary Chapel
Mhm.
setting where I am, or just an evangelical church that maybe has had a low view of communion in the past and are repenting of that error? I don't know what that looks like. So it's kind of autobiographical too, because it's like, hey, here's
Yeah.
what we did in our church and this didn't work.
Yeah.
A lot of that.
Man, even yeah, so that's really interesting, like, the idea that I guess in a way to sort of recapture sort of a high view of communion,
Yeah.
the church would have to go through a season of repentance for whatever took
Yeah.
place
Yeah.
to bring about this kind of low view of communion. Like,
Yeah.
what was that? Why did we stop doing this? Why
Well,
did we
and all the ideas that are attached to it.
Yeah.
Because when you see, like, it's really a humbling thing to read works from people who thought it was really, really important. I
Mhm.
mean, including like Luther and Calvin and
Yeah.
people like that, because they're saying like this is a matter of importance, like the incarnation. What you believe about this determines
Yeah.
what you believe about Jesus. And you're like, I don't think it's that important.
Right.
And that's humbling because you realize you're not in good company when
Mm.
you're minimizing something that men of faith throughout centuries have held in high regard. Um,
Yeah.
I think, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, where there's a loneliness in
Mm.
the just kind of modern Western evangelical church that
Yeah.
you can't
Yeah.
have, and then where people kind of like look across the fence and say, like, well, it looks good over there. What these other traditions are maybe
Yeah.
doing, and that was a big appeal of the master's program that you and I did, where we're seeing like throughout centuries, there's this call that you get to actually answer to, and you're like, oh,
Mhm.
I'm part of a
Mhm.
greater tradition. I'm part of
Mhm.
something
Mhm.
else that's been going on, and communion for me has been that thing that like every century of the church has called out, and then
Mhm.
you have this call and response, and you're realizing, like, I don't know my lines. I don't know what it's like. Sweet Caroline.
I didn't but
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't
So
rehearse this one. Right.
yeah,
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Calling out is really
yeah.
interesting. I just did, sort of a reflection on, on Revelation and the fact that
Yeah.
the church is actually called out of the whore of Babylon. Have you
Yeah.
ever noticed this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
the whore is there, and I was like, "Okay, how do you move?" It's like Revelation chapter
Mhm,
19. How do you move 18 and 19, I guess. How do you move from this whore to
mhm.
this bride? And, um, and what it is that Christ calls his bride out,
Yeah.
and there's this transformation that takes place, um, prior to the marriage supper, prior to the bride being ready for her wedding. And I do sense that we're in a really interesting season as far as the church,
Mhm,
however you define that.
mhm.
Um, you and I, sort of going through, we're both working in Christian ministry in a time where it seems like a lot of life has moved online. I mean,
Yeah.
I did a degree online. You've done a degree online. You're continuing your education largely online, right? I mean, you're
Mhm.
doing a lot of communicating with professors and things like that digitally, and we're sort of meeting in digital space. And
Yeah.
um, again, I think that early on there was a resistance to digital media or whatever, the internet,
Yeah.
and it's a
Yeah.
scary place, and you don't go there, it's dangerous. Um, and yet somehow it's brought about some sort of transformation in the church. Well, I mean, I guess essentially it's God bringing about some sort of transformation in the church. And I think one of the things for me has been that sort of ecumenical view of like there's a lot of people who are not part of my tradition. I don't even know what my tradition is. Like, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I
Right.
became a missionary. I worked with all kinds of different churches. Like, I'm such a hodgepodge of a bunch of different things, but
What is Presbyterian YWAM? Like,
I
where does that
yeah,
work?
I don't think there is a Presbyterian YWAM, but
It's
I guess
you.
maybe
It's you,
I'm
man.
that,
Yeah.
whatever that means. If you can have the if you can have it, here I am.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I've always loved that. And so
Yeah.
thinking about communion and thinking about the fact that there is kind of this part of the body of Christ that I don't know, what would you say, and you're kind of coming from sort of a Calvary Chapel perspective, do people just sort of like, what's the view of communion? Like, what
Oh,
would
yeah.
most people just be like,
Um,
"Oh, this is kind of like it's a time for me to remember Jesus,"
that's right. Yeah, it's
you know?
the most common view for communion, like the practice, the bread, the cup, that thing, is a opportunity for the individual to remember what Jesus did on the cross. That's
Right.
that's pretty much what the full extent of what it is. And one thing that I've been saying, it's kind of my own I hesitate to say this and tell people I've done this, but it described like I wrote my own liturgy. Like you
Yeah.
can't really do that. Like it's
Right.
but this is one thing that I tell my people every single Sunday when we take communion every single Sunday. I say this is a way for you to meet with Christ.
Yeah.
And that shift of like this is for me to remember
Mm.
the cross. And it's like I'm not going to tell you not to think about the cross, but you need to know that this is a way for you to meet with Christ.
Yeah.
The communion means something. It's a coming together of the minds,
Mm.
um, or in this case, even the bodies,
Yeah.
and that changes you.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, but I think that the common understanding, the way that I was raised, I think basically every other evangelical church is going to have like a memorialist view
Right,
of
right.
saying this is a chance for you to remember something.
Yeah.
And I'm really convinced there's more to it than that. I've really enjoyed seeing more in it than that.
We're talk about that a little bit more.
Okay, sure. Um,
Moreness.
yeah, the more. A common phrase in like the Reformed circles that that take kind of Calvin's view on thing is the point of real presence.
Mm.
And it's a pretty broad spectrum, shouldn't be that controversial phrase because you can
Right.
go from like Catholic transubstantiation on one side, like, sure, they believe in real presence. And then you can go like Lutheran and Calvinist or Reformed all the way to like, it's like, well, I guess that would be the end of there, where it's like it's a spiritual presence. We're not talking about a change that takes place in bread or wine or anything
Right,
like
right,
that.
right.
But the idea is that Christ is here and
Yeah.
presenting himself and all his benefits. That's an important part to you
Mm.
right now. Like everything that you say your salvation is, like he gives you things in salvation. He's giving it all to you in this moment of meeting with him.
Mm.
So even the phrases, I've tried to be careful in the phrase of like, we talk about, oh, we're going to go take communion.
Right, right, right,
It's
right.
like take a pill, like take your medicine.
Mm.
And I want to get into the habit of being like, I'm receiving
Yeah,
communion.
yeah,
I'm receiving all the benefits that Christ
yeah,
has given me, in himself in
yeah,
this moment. And that's just, I've asked people who've had kind of a problem with it a little bit. I'm like, if you could choose, if you just got to decide whether or not this is a way for you to remember something or a
yeah,
way for Jesus to come and touch you,
yeah, yeah.
which one do you want? Because we can do it your way if you think it'll be more fun. But like, I I like this. I resonate with. I crave this idea
Mhm.
of real presence.
Yeah,
Which is again broad. I'm not even going to try and like define that and be like, from Aquinas to Calvin.
yeah.
Where do we fit? It's like we don't. I don't want to become too narrow in that phrase. Um,
Do you
yeah.
feel like there is was there an attempt to understand the mystery,
Mm. Hmm.
um, somewhere along the line?
Yeah.
It and it not in a bad way, like,
Sure.
I'm not against that, but it's like, I in some way, Christ is mysteriously with
Yeah.
his people, and then we were like, "Okay, well, but really how?
But
Like,
how?
but how?
Yeah.
Give
But
me the facts. What's the
yeah.
fact here? Is he really here? Well, what do you mean by really here?" Like,
Well,
and do you
that's
think that that's
exactly it.
maybe part of what brought us to this sort of, like, low view? It's like, "Fine, everybody out. You know what? It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
symbolic. Move on."
This is way
And
easier.
we lost it, because
Yeah.
and not that it's bad to try to figure out what it is,
No, I
but
think it's good. I think it's good even.
yeah,
Um,
it is good to figure. Yeah.
if well, especially if those are the questions that your world is asking.
Yeah.
So like I have to cut. So like, on the one extreme, you've got, transubstantiation, which is a phrase that predates Aquinas, but really it's his formulation of it that kind of stood. And they're like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what we mean. And like I try and cut him a bit of slack because it's like he is interacting with the rediscovery of Greek philosophy that talked about what a thing is and what it
Mhm.
means to be a thing. And so, like in academia, which is a weird place to live anyway, but people were talking about,
Mhm.
um, they were talking about what stuff is
Right.
and what a thing is, and is it
Mhm.
is it a thing just because you can see it, or is it a thing because is there another thing beneath? And it's all the
Right.
Platonic stuff, and it was, the rediscovery of Aristotle and his stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so he was engaging in his time and answering these questions that were being asked. Like, no one's asking those questions anymore.
Hmm.
So we shouldn't just have the same answers.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I don't mind people with, especially if you're a genius like Thomas Aquinas, for like trying to answer the questions.
Yeah,
Like,
trying to
sure,
figure it out.
go ahead,
Yeah.
try and answer the
Yeah.
questions. Um, but yeah, like the Orthodox tradition really kind of prides themselves on not trying to define the mystery.
Right. Right.
So if someone asks them like, "How?" They're like, no, wrong, no,
You're asking the wrong question.
we're not gonna do that."
Yeah.
So, like, I
Yeah.
respect that. I kinda like that. Um, but to just it's like that thing where so when we talk about, like, the Holy Spirit and the gifts and
Mhm.
all that kind of complicated stuff, people talk about, like, the abuse of
Mm.
the gifts of the Holy Spirit or
Mhm.
spiritual charisms, and then you have to remember, well, neglect is abuse as well.
Hmm.
Like neglecting something is abusing it just in a different thing. So you have that spectrum, you got to kind of find that balance. I think with the Eucharist and explaining things, and it's like, okay, like we're not going to be able to explain that just like we can't explain the resurrection or the incarnation or Pentecost. But to just like ignore it
Right.
is just as bad as having a bad explanation because your bad explanation is that this doesn't mean anything.
It- it-
Um, yeah.
so, and I'm trying to think of like ministry in the Brave New World, right? Ministry
Yeah.
in like
Yeah.
sort of this world that we're in right now, which
Yeah.
is, by the way, just really does feel
What
like
a
we're
place.
in one of those dystopian novels.
Yeah. What a place.
Um, is it possible that we lost this sort of high view, or even liturgy, right? And I think that's one
Mhm.
thing, and I've said this before, but I work in student ministry, and so like I'm always sort of like trying to project myself into the future to prepare students for that future,
Yeah.
and I'm looking at these students, and I think that there's something about even the liturgy that is comforting to
Yes.
students. So our church,
Yeah.
we don't the liturgy is not like right in your face. You're not like going here and you're like, okay, but we're doing this and we're doing that, and there's like
Yeah.
instructions. But there is a rhythm to our worship service, and that rhythm or that pattern is repeated every Sunday,
Right.
except
Yeah.
for communion, which we don't do every Sunday. And I,
But once you read my paper, you will. No.
we do it, we do it monthly, we try to do
Yeah.
it regularly, that type of thing. But so there is a pattern, and if you're aware of such things, you'll notice, oh, this is how, like, we always start with a call to worship. We have a time of confession. I think that is important.
That's very good.
And then we have the preaching of the word, the reading and the preaching of the word.
Mhm.
And it does seem like, and I don't know if this is true,
Mhm.
but it was like somewhere along the way, we got really used to an academized sort of faith, or an industrialized sort of church. Does
Yeah.
that
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
like
No, that does.
pastors were going through the academy
Mhm.
much in the same way that lawyers were going through the
Doctor. Very, very
academy, or
much similar,
doctors,
like
or yeah, exactly. So they were becoming specialists
Mhm.
at the same time that the world was becoming more industrious, right? And
Yeah.
so it was kind of like, well, how do we package this thing? Like all this stuff, like liturgy, which now we've got
Order
to
book.
ask, we've
Yeah.
got to answer
Right.
questions like, why do we do it this way?
Mhm.
Or communion. Now we've got to answer questions like, what is it really?
Mhm.
That all kind of gets in the way of us being able to sort of provide a clean product, to sort of
Sure.
a consumer
Sure.
base, if
Sure.
you will.
Yeah.
And I wonder and I don't know if you've explored that at all or much in your paper, but that's something that has been, since starting this podcast, since kind of having these conversations, something that I've really played with. Just and because I'm trying to understand where we've been, so
Yeah.
that I can understand where we're going.
Right. Understand the time. So
And I wonder if we lost sort of the liturgy and the Eucharist along the way, as church sort of became more of this sort of, yeah, whatever you want to call it, sort of like a
maybe, yeah, either
institutional church.
theater or clinic or yeah, a lot of things you could compare.
Yeah.
So there's this comment made on one of the last videos you did with Paul Vanderklay and that um, all those people. Um,
All the people.
all the
Is it
people and yeah, one of the guys asked this question, kind of a throwaway, comment. It's like, do you think we'll still be doing church the same way in 200 years? That seems really unlikely. And my gut reaction is like, yeah, we will. On all the important things,
Right,
we'll be doing it exactly the same.
right.
But each generation really does have to not reinvent the liturgy or anything, but rediscover
Yeah.
a number of timeless things to break them out of their generation. Because it's like, oh, the now is so oppressively um,
Mm.
novel oriented. It's so new, and then uh, you see something timeless, and the liturgy is kind of an answer to that ache. I think. I mean, the Word of
Yeah,
God, of course, being like another
yeah,
real answer to that thing. But then you go say like, oh, what if we did church like in a small group setting where we just like opened the Bible and like shared a meal, and you think like. I've seen like every college ministry do this, and they think they're inventing like a new way of doing church. And you're like, you mean the New Testament? Like this isn't really
yeah,
novel, but you do have to have like each generation kind of rediscover like what this is about. And an unchanging liturgy does that in one way, and then
mm,
the conversations are something that feels so new
mm,
because you're making it up as you go, just like we're doing right now.
yeah.
and that answers, I think another kind of ache in
Yeah.
the stomach of people wanting something more.
Yeah. So, okay,
Yeah.
along the lines of will we be doing church differently?
Yeah.
This is and it was part of that video,
Yeah,
part of the
there's part of
conversation
it.
with Paul Vanderklay, and part of the reason you and I wanted to have this conversation
Mhm.
was, I think, the comment about the communion of the saints.
Mhm.
And Paul was saying, you have this church, you have the Catholics and it's the Eucharist.
Yeah.
You have the Orthodox and it's the liturgy. You have the Protestants and it's the preaching of the word.
Right.
And we're entering into a time where it's the communion of the saints. Not that those things will go away, not that we dispense with the
Mhm.
preaching of the
Mhm.
word, not that we
No.
dispense with the liturgy of the Eucharist, but that they will they're like function stacking.
Yeah.
And there's a part of the church that has yet to be explored
Yeah.
very deeply. And I might be wrong about this, it's not an area of study of mine, but
Mhm.
like, what is the communion of the saints and how is it possible? Like, that's another one of those mysterious things where it's like, oh, so we're like, as Christians, we're all sort of like mysteriously related to one another, past,
Yeah.
present, and future.
Yeah.
You and I are related because the same spirit that raised Christ Jesus from the
Mhm.
dead dwells in you and dwells in me.
And the dead. And
And
this,
the
like,
and
same
those
same
who like
same
right again,
conversation
yeah,
that
sort of,
Matt,
and
yeah,
those who will
yeah,
come, those who
yeah,
will come in the
right,
future. But like,
right.
but now we're
Mm,
well, it's almost like we have a vantage point to
mhm.
see what the communion of the saints is
Yeah,
because we're recording all of these conversations and they live in this digital space that
right.
sort of gives us a bird's eye view, almost like
Yep,
Socrates in the Republics sort of said, let's look at the city.
sure. Yeah,
Let's expand our view out and just look at the city and then address the soul of humanity by looking at the city from like
right.
30,000 feet. It's almost like we're able to do that with the church and say, well, like, what's going on in the church? And does this mean we will do church differently? And yeah, I think your
Mhm.
point is a good one, which is we're not
In the essentials,
losing.
no,
Yeah, we're not
but it'll look
losing
different
the
to you.
what makes yeah.
Yeah.
But there is kind of this question, and maybe I'll bring it down to like just the base level, which is how do you do church when people's lives move online? Like how do you
Yeah.
participate in the communion of the saints? How do you not neglect sort of
Mhm.
meeting together? I mean, the fact that I mean,
Yeah.
on the one hand, you and I have been able to maintain conversation and connection because of these digital
Yeah.
tools. Whereas I guess if these tools didn't exist, you and I could still write letters to each other or something like
Mhm.
that. Um, but here we are sort of talking face to face. We're sort of talking, um, you know, what would you call it? Like what are these? Icons, avatars, whatever they are. We're using.
Images.
Yeah, I
I
mean it is an imagistic sort of, but anyway, so that's my
Yeah.
whole thing of like, yeah, communion of the saints and what is
So
it and where are we
yeah.
and
So I think I have 2 different answers. I was thinking about this, and this excited me to think about. Um, so there's a way in which this communion of the saints, or the fellowship, because I to
mhm,
back up also um, those 4 things, even like what Paul was saying, so
yeah,
it's like, oh, like the liturgy or the Eucharist, or preaching of the word and the fellowship. It's not the Apostles' Creed, which was another comment that was made. It's like this is Acts 2:42. Like
okay,
those things aren't in but they're
right,
apostles' doctrine, so
yeah,
preaching,
yeah,
yeah, prayers, which could be liturgy, the corporate prayers, breaking of bread, Eucharist, and fellowship of the saints. It's not in that order. I messed that up, but yeah. And
right,
so we're like communion of the saints. Um, in one way, you need the embodiment of a gathered people
mhm,
physically.
mhm,
But then when you identify that as a unique and special thing, that opens up the alternative kind of communion of the saints
yeah,
for being what it is. And to parallel this, I'll actually pull in your comments on our long-haired British friend, um
Russel Brand.
Russell Brand. Yeah, I'm like Brant. I couldn't think of his name. Yeah. So Okay, so he is preaching.
Right.
He is preaching, and a lot of guys with YouTube channels are some of the, with everything. But then when you recognize there is an office of, say, pastor, or even if you want to go like apostles, prophets,
Mhm.
evangelist, pastor, teacher, and you say like there's a real distinction between someone who is the authority over a local church and a guy with a
Mhm.
YouTube channel, that
Mhm.
there's a
Mhm.
distinction that both safeguards, the populace from thinking like anyone with a microphone is all the same. And
Right.
it's like, well, that's not the same as church. That's not the same. But then it
Right.
also frees up the Russell Brands of the world for what I think may be like their calling. And it's not
Yeah.
to be someone's pastor right now,
Mhm.
but it is to be this could be controversial, but to have a prophetic voice, a lowercase
Mm.
p in parentheses,
Mhm. Mhm.
prophetic voice of one from the outside speaking in.
Yeah.
And so with communion of saints, like I think communion of saints includes like being with other people, praying, ministering the gospel, going out two by two, reaching communities in actual locations. I imagine there's a lot of communion of the saints going on right now in your neck of the woods and Western North Carolina,
Yeah.
and there's communion of the
Yeah.
saints happening there. And you realize there's kind of like an official capacity that involves like the physicality,
Mm.
then you see like as the supporting role, it's what we're doing now. And I think
Mhm.
various digital platforms that are impossible to maintain just physically.
Yeah.
For example, like we talk about
Yeah.
these other traditions, and we're not really sure where our traditions are. Like, I don't know any actual, I don't know, pick a denomination, like Orthodox
Mhm.
Christian. Like, there's
Okay.
not an Orthodox church in
Mhm.
North Fork or Oakhurst or, this part of California.
Mhm.
But through books, of course, and then like the digital world, you can explore those the
Yeah.
traditions of our brothers and sisters in that place that we just can't physically.
Yeah.
Um, so
Well, and that's one of the things about yeah, yeah, about how sort of the Orthodox do church.
mhm,
It's like they're gonna be slow at moving and building new churches, which is why there's probably not an Orthodox church,
right.
near you. And so this digital platform has given other areas of the church more of a voice, more of a reach, however you want to say it. Like um the Russell Brand the Russell Brand piece is interesting because there's a part of me um that, it was the Steve Lawson
Yeah.
controversy that happened almost at the same time as Russell Brand's baptism. So in my mind, the two events there are almost locked in. I think they're a little
Mhm.
apart from each other,
Yeah, he was
maybe
baptized
by
he
several
was
weeks or
baptized,
maybe
a
a
bit
month or two.
before, but
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that could
Um, but I
be.
dealt with them at the same time. So for
Mhm,
me,
mhm.
they came into my
Good
sort of my
experience.
reality. I was like,
Yeah.
um,
Mm,
and so you have this question, and maybe it's a side quest, maybe it's something, not to be distracted by, but it's like, is Russell Brand's conversion genuine? How do we see
yeah.
the church manifesting if we are not able to be in that same physical space? Like your point about Western North Carolina or
Yeah.
Eastern Tennessee,
Yeah.
it's like the church is doing kingdom of God things
Mm,
there, and I'm a little bit more aware of it because I can sort of see it
yeah.
online, but what am I really seeing? I'm seeing images of people that look like they're living self-sacrificially the way Christ would call us to live,
Yeah.
but but I'm not there, so what am I really seeing? But because the digital space affords me some view of it,
Yeah.
it's just a question of what is it? And so I now that I've posed the question in that video,
Yeah.
um, I really have to pay attention to Russell Brand because I'm like, okay, how do you judge? You sort of judge a tree by its fruit,
Sure.
and I guess what we then would be judging is specifically what's being said and how it's being said. I think
Yeah.
with let's say if Russell Brand was to write a book about his conversion,
Mhm.
that would be helpful. I could read his book and kind of sort out what I feel he's saying,
Yeah.
but now I'm seeing him say it. And so I get to do that sifting in a different way.
Yeah.
His intonation, his body language comes through
Mhm.
because we're recording these things digitally. So and then juxtapose that to somebody like Steve Lawson, who I don't know his ministry. I just know that he's a pastor who had to step down because of a moral failing. Um,
Yeah.
and because he worked with
Okay,
because okay,
Ligonier,
there you go. There it
yeah,
is.
yeah.
Because he worked for Legionnaire
Mhm.
and because by reputation, I think, "Oh gosh, those guys are serious, man."
Ligonier.
Like, probably, like, too
Yeah,
serious for me. Like,
yeah,
if
right.
you're
Yeah,
if you're
yeah.
gonna be a pastor, if you're gonna be a teacher within that sphere,
Yeah.
I mean, you gotta be, like, straight as an arrow. You
Mm,
gotta be a fine, upstanding,
yeah.
very faithful preacher of the word, really well versed.
Mhm,
You gotta be at the top of your game, but inside, he had this moral failure.
mhm.
So on the outside, he looks like what we in the modern Western evangelical whatever
Yeah,
world would say, "Oh, that's a preacher. That's a
yeah.
pastor." He looks like a pastor on the outside. Inside, he's got some moral um, temptation and sin that's going on that he's not confessed to anybody, that he has not reached out to the communion of the saints, the priesthood of all believers. He is not doing life in communion, even though he might be in physical space with these people. He's withdrawn. There's something
There's an
inside him that
isolation.
he's
There's
not
definitely an
living out.
isolation. Yeah.
And you juxtapose that to Russell Brand, who is a
Maybe more
complete and
maybe
total
more
moral retard.
like him to be. Yeah, yeah.
I guess I'm not supposed to say that, huh? But, like, yeah, like, he started out as a complete failure.
Yeah.
So now, like, my expectations of Russell Brand are really low.
Sure, yeah.
Like, so if
I mean,
he
we've
if
already seen
he
what you can do. Yeah.
yeah, if he stumbles upon some sort of, y preaching ministry or something, or maybe even more, I would see him more being sort of evangelistic
Yeah,
than as a
yeah.
preacher or a teacher.
Expository.
Um,
Yeah.
but he will probably move people to Jesus. I mean, he
Good.
probably already
Hope
has,
I really hope
even
so. Yeah.
if his Christianity is still kind of um, a a sort of like a, synchronistic mash of Christianity and mysticism that he
Yeah, yeah.
has from his
Occasionally out.
previous,
Right.
prior to his conversion,
Yeah.
which I actually think may benefit him and may benefit the church, but maybe that's like a side quest to the side quest. It's just,
Mhm.
to me, I don't wanna be Gnostic. I don't wanna de-emphasize the physical world,
Mhm.
but there's a part of me that wonders if we're starting to realize that even going back to, you're talking about Aquinas, or Aristotle and these philosophers who are trying to figure out what the thing is. You can describe the thing, that there's like the material cause and I always get the causes all mixed up, but
Final cause is the last one. I remember that. Yeah.
um
Yeah.
it's
Effective
it's
cause.
like you can describe the thing from
Mhm.
these different levels of causation, right? And
Yeah.
we fixate on the material,
Yeah.
even though there's more to talk about than
Mhm.
the material, I guess would be my point,
Yeah.
about that. So
Yeah. Thinking about a Russell Brand type character, uh, and seeing, I mean, he's a good example of someone who, or a good situation where like some of these things can't happen on the internet. Like everyone agreed, like, well,
right.
he needs a church. Someone's got to be this guy's pastor. I'm not raising my hand and volunteering for that, but like, that was, came up in the discussion. Um, but one of the interesting things that uh, Paul had mentioned, I think, Vanderclay, that Brand might need a guy in a robe.
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
you're like, I mean, I could see him going Anglican, I don't know, but
Yeah.
like, or whatever, he's definitely attracted to some of those things. And one of the things that was said in that discussion was just like, you're young at being new.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
there's these things that can give him a really a proper framework,
Yeah.
some of that stability. And we know like there's freedom in that kind of discipline.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that for someone whose voice is on, the wild west of the internet,
Hmm.
to have something like that, like an anchor in either, in history and in the physical, is just going to benefit that person, not so that they just don't go crazy, but they have like the borders in place to be free.
Hmm.
Um, and so, and this goes to the whole like just the question of meeting with the body of Christ in an online space, having the physical and the traditional behind them in whatever communities they
Mhm.
are in, gives those, whatever those voices are, really the stability to be able
Hmm.
to talk to each other and to have conversations like we're having,
Hmm.
and to maybe reach out and minister in a, I guess, a lowercase c communion of the saints
Hmm.
way, to where if it was just the digital that replaced
Right.
physical, it would be disorienting. It wouldn't,
Yeah. Right. Right.
and
Right.
then we'd have to be like, what's our statement of faith again? This group online? Like, we need to
Right.
figure
Right.
out what the name of our movement is. And you're like, no,
Yeah. Cool.
don't.
Because yeah, the myth is that doing any of this online somehow dislocates it from the physical, which is
Oh, right.
impossible. Like,
You
I'm
can't do it.
anchored in the physical world.
Right.
You are anchored in the physical world. It's just that
Mhm.
your geography and my geography are separated by 2,000
And
miles.
like all of technology is making miles smaller, you know, steam engine, roads,
Yeah,
internet,
right, right, right.
make
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
People used to take this journey, and it would take like 3 or 4 months, and people
Yeah.
would die along the way. Now you get in a plane, you fly out west. It takes you a couple hours, and you complain that there wasn't your favorite cocktail or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's perfect.
things were better maybe when we were just riding around on covered wagons and stuff like that. Maybe, and maybe that's a myth too, right?
Yeah. It was never
Um,
better. That's what
people
Ecclesiastes says.
people have been people for a long time.
Mhm.
Um,
Hmm.
s- so does Russell need a guy in a robe?
Well,
Um,
here's yeah, and I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't know any guys in robes. You know what I mean?
my
Like,
my
when I meet
follow-up to
somebody,
that was like, do all of us kind of need a guy
I
in a
need a
robe?
guy
Do
in a
all of
robe.
us need like
Yeah,
well,
maybe a dead one. Like,
I was just what I was
we
gonna
go back,
say is
right?
I did a live stream following up on kind of the Russell Brand question, and
Yeah.
I scrolled through all of the not all of the posts, but most of the posts that Russell um, shared throughout this year,
Mhm.
beginning with February. And one of the things that I noticed was that he picked up a book by Henry Nouwen.
Okay.
He picked up the
Wow.
Prodigal Son book by Henry Nouwen.
Okay.
Not a guy in a robe, but kind of guy in robe adjacent.
Close. Yeah, pretty close. Yeah.
Yeah. Desert father, desert father like
Yeah.
miss Christian mysticism
Sure.
light,
Mhm.
potentially. And again, that kind of takes us back to the Eucharist, the communion of the saints. Like there is sort of a mystery that doesn't have me dislocated from my body,
Mhm.
but certainly seems like I can I, almost sort of like project myself into the imaginal space, and that is real to some extent, and that God is doing something
Mhm.
in that space,
Yeah.
like again, I can touch my desk. I'm not disembodied here,
Yeah.
but to you, I kind of am. I'm just a picture on a screen talking at you.
But
Um,
Yeah, so I think the comparison that ought to be made then to these communities, these online communities, is not so much like, okay, is it your home group Bible study
Mhm.
where you've got like a bunch of chicken wings and Pepsi and a Bible and then people and this one smells this way and that
Right.
one looks that way. And then we have the online thing. It's like, no, no, no. The online communities are more like libraries. Because
Okay.
like we're okay. Like I've got books. You've got books. And we're really grateful for having these voices um from the past that we're able to interact with. I mean,
Yeah.
that was one of the appeals of our the master's program that we
Yeah.
did too, is where we got to actually join a conversation that was already happening for centuries before, and we get to actually speak into it, and then the books answer. Like the voices, they actually talk back at you, and you realize like you're in a community with all these dead people, communion of saints, question mark. And it doesn't take away from your physicality at all. I mean, if you
Right.
isolate yourself in the library and then never talked to anyone in your town, then yeah, it could, but in general it's just part of thinking. And so
So
having on these online communities, I think it's more like that, probably
okay.
living people.
I, another. This is another side quest. Sorry.
Okay, let's do it.
Um,
Okay, extra points.
Jonathan Peugeot
Hmm.
has been developing something that I'm trying to key in on, which is sort of the prophetic imagination. It's almost like humanity as a whole, not necessarily individuals, but humanity as a whole is almost equipped with like a prophetic imagination that we can sort of we try to grapple with the future by projecting ourselves into that imagined future, and then the stories that emerge are the ones that ring true for the most amount of people,
Okay.
um, and by doing and then as those stories endure, they actually seem to be projecting they seem to be predicting the future,
Yeah.
a la Brave New World,
Sure.
1984,
Sure.
all of that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and Goodwill Hunting talked about this. Goodwill Hunting predicted this future when Robin Williams asks Will Hunting, not Ben Affleck, but the other guy, Matt
Okay.
Damon. He says, "Do you have any friends, Will? Do you have any friends? People you can trust?" And he's like, "Yeah, I got friends." And he starts naming off Kant, Pope, Locke,
Okay. Okay.
he starts
Yeah.
naming off all his
Uh,
favorite philosophers and
philosophers.
authors
Yeah.
and stuff like that. He says, "But you can't really have a conversation with them, Will." It's like, "Not without a bunch of smelling salts and a heater, you know?"
Yeah.
And it's like, but you kind of like to your point, it's like you
True.
kind of
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
You kind of can. Like that is this sort of the sort of power of the imaginal,
Mhm.
um that it's almost like we've taken that great conversation that has existed in the written form,
Mhm.
and we've just like 10x'd it. We just
Yeah.
like
We're
it's
putting it back in the forum, maybe.
yeah,
Putting it back in the public
it's
square.
say that again?
Putting it back in the public square
Yeah,
instead of just, you and your book.
yeah,
Which, okay, so this ties back into Communion of Saints very well too, because like Robin Williams' point of you can't just sit there with the books, like that's not a community, that's not
right,
friendship. But
right.
like you and I have both benefited from having guides lead us
Yeah,
in books that we probably couldn't understand to the best
yeah,
of, like I can read it and I can be like, I know enough to know that it was important and that I missed it. But I need a teacher. Like I need a guide or a community to kind of like help me sort this out. And this could be where like the church is heading in this communion of saints
mm,
era, not neglecting like the
yeah,
apostles' doctrine, prayer, breaking bread, anything like that, but we throw around this idea of like being Bereans, right?
okay,
And so I read an article a few years ago, I think it was on Gospel Coalition, that about this Berean idea that we think we like being a Berean is hearing the thing and then going to our Bible and then making sure
mhm,
it's true.
mhm.
But you have to consider that the Bereans did not have pocket editions of the Old
They
Testament.
didn't have those little teeny tiny
Oh,
Bibles?
the
Oh,
Gideons
no,
had
right, right,
in
right, okay,
their hotels yet. Yeah,
sorry.
but so like to search the scriptures
Yeah,
as a group of people meant being a group of people around the scriptures.
yeah,
And so instead of picturing people hearing Paul and being like, I'm going to go look at my Bible, and then they just like off screen, they would have gone. The suggestion is they would have gone as a group of people, many people around one book, and then searched it out to determine whether these things are true or not. So I think that the communion of saints is being people gathered around a book and books,
Okay, yeah. Because it's
rather than being Goodwill Hunting and just having
right.
poke everybody by
Yeah,
himself.
Will was isolated. Will was isolated,
Yeah,
but he was trying to access the wisdom of the ancient past
yeah,
through the books.
yeah,
Um, I think, yeah, it's like it's sort of a one-sided conversation at that point.
hmm
But they come to life in that community, and certainly Scripture, I think, is what does that in the most sort of potent way.
yeah,
Um, there's really something to that idea of a group of people centered around like a central point of focus, right? I mean,
mhm,
is essentially what a community is. It's like we're all here attending to this same thing,
yeah,
and yet you come at it at a slightly different angle than I come at it. None of us have the exact same approach, and yet we can learn from one another and sort of sharpen each other
hmm
along the way, so like I wonder in this sort of we're sort of playing a game here. We're sort of gaming this like this and I've, we're using Russell Brand or
yeah,
whatever as an example.
hmm
Is I do hope Russell is has in-person mentorship, and it seems like
yeah.
he does.
Seems like he does. Yeah, there's people.
um but is there, and in this imagined world, Russell stumbles upon this conversation, and then you and I become part of his communion of the saints, right? In
Yeah.
some weird way,
Well,
we're
or
part of the
yeah,
people that we're all centered around this, but we're all attending to this one thing.
he
And
becomes part of our community. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. You're on my right, and then sort of Russell's on my left in this, magic world we call the internet. But we're all sort of trying to understand this Jesus person.
well, and to see how real that is, and maybe an unmeasurable, mysterious way. But when I found out about Steve Lawson,
Right.
and it was the news broke, and I saw it right then, and a friend who's a pastor messages me the link too, and he's like, hey, did you see this? Like, we had both seen him at a conference a couple of years ago,
Hmm.
and like knew who this guy was, and he's just like, do any of us make it? It was just like this discouraging thing, and I was feeling like personally affronted, not like by Steve Lawson, who's never met me.
Right,
I'll
right, right,
never,
right.
I've listened to one sermon by the guy, and then little clips on YouTube, maybe. Never read
Yeah,
any of his books if he's written any. I don't even know, but it
yeah.
felt like a personal, like how dare you? Like, how dare you do this? I feel for your
Mm,
wife. I feel for your kids. I feel for your church, and like I'm
yeah,
part of that, even though
yeah,
we're different faith traditions and everything. And so like there is a unity of the body,
yeah,
and a communion of saints where it's like
yeah.
Russell Brand doesn't know us, but now what he does matters to me on
Hmm.
more than just like a voyeuristic kind of like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
way. It's like, oh, look what he did now. It's like, no, it matters. It matters what you
Mm,
do. There is a real communion that maybe whether it's going to church physically or doing something like this, we're
right.
tapping into spiritual realities that are beyond our ability to explain. Oh,
I had
yeah,
that same experience. I think that's right. I mean, what you do matters to me because we are united by the same
really,
spirit.
really sorry about that.
Yeah, I know.
Right? Yeah.
Dude. Um, but I mean, I felt that way when news came out about Ravi Zacharias. I
Yeah.
mean, I
Yeah,
listened to
exactly.
hundreds of hours
Yeah.
of Ravi. I read, I think at that point, I mean, definitely most of his books, maybe not all of his books. I
Yeah.
mean, I did classes that were guided by Ravi Zacharias,
Uh,
resources,
yeah.
and then it was just like, wow, man, like really wow, like there's some twisted stuff going on in that guy's life, and I still kind of, like,
It
mourn
aches. That
that.
left a mark, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Though I never met him.
Yeah.
I never occupied the same physical space as Ravi Zacharias ever.
Uh-huh.
Like, I never went to a conference where he was speaking. I never none of that. It was all through podcasts
Yeah.
and books, you know? Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, there is something to that, and I
You'll
wonder, um, I wonder if there's a greater deal of accountability. It's weird, right? Because we're on the internet, right? Where
yeah.
we could just be this could be all fake. This could be complete and total. This is WWE, right? We're just
Mhm, mhm.
nobody know like the wall behind me could be a facade. You don't know, right? Um, so at the same time that it seems like the internet is giving us more and more opportunities to lie, it seems like it's getting harder and harder to pull off the lie. And I
Oh, oh,
wonder if that's
yeah.
part of what's being refined in the church.
Mhm.
The church that
Yeah.
exists online, I'm probably gonna get pushback from this, is
Mhm.
in some way more authentic than the church that
Mhm.
meets in physical space.
Yeah.
And I
Oh,
can
yeah.
yeah, go
I
ahead.
had an idea about that. Okay, so this idea of, well, like an outside community speaking truth towards the inside community,
Yeah, yeah,
you know, whether it's like someone like Russell Brand speaking things that like the
yeah,
church needs to hear, that's way more mature in their faith than
right.
he is, or whatever. But like that's not new. And that was a comment in the other video, like, Russell, you're new at this novelty thing. Because if you think about it, you've got like Christianity originally being
Yeah,
outsiders speaking into a Jewish community about
yeah,
their Messiah
yeah,
from their own scriptures. It's just like such arrogance, right? Like, and the like Greco-Roman world, the church took their myth and their Platonic understanding of this and that in the world and took it as its own, you know, plundered the Egyptians. And they're
yeah,
like, all truth, it's ours now. That's actually all about Jesus. And they spoke back into their world as outsiders. And then, you follow church history and you see when the church became more institutionalized, you have people
mm,
in every generation who are in the church, but clearly on the fringes or on the outside of like the walls of the institution. You have like St. Francis, outsiders speaking back to the authority within the church,
mhm,
even while submitting to it in his own
mhm,
way, but like completely different. And so having that in every age might be something we should learn to expect, you know? And it doesn't undo the institution or the
right,
central, like, in
yeah,
one way, in 200 years, it's going to be the same.
yeah,
But in 200 years, there's definitely going to be like a youth movement that doesn't want to do things the way their parents did.
right.
And they're going to think for like a solid 6 months that they're original and they're
Yeah,
not.
right.
But they're gonna do it, and that's good and it's healthy. You need the fresh air.
Yeah,
Um, so like having, these kinds of
huh,
conversations be more authentic, that rings true to me,
yeah,
um, as a design, as a feature, not a bug, even like
yeah,
as a feature in for the church, as a helpful thing for the institutionalized church to
yeah,
have something. We got to have these voices somewhere that can have these conversations in ways that just, it might even be inappropriate to try and
mhm,
replicate these kinds of things in like the Sunday morning service church.
yeah,
Um, I would tend to think that way, in fact.
yeah.
But
Yeah, it seems like, and I think like sort of authenticity or something. I mean, it's almost sort of overused.
yeah, it's
Um,
overvalued.
it's like, but if you think back to sort of the 20th century, I think one of the biggest things, and I can say this as somebody who didn't grow up in the church,
Mhm.
I think one of the biggest hurdles for people coming into the church has always been this sense of hypocrisy,
Yeah,
that the
yeah,
church lives sort of condemning, the world, which certainly is true. Like
mhm,
we're gonna go into places where people are being sacrificed, ritualistically and
right.
say,
But that's
"That's evil. Don't do
good.
that."
We're gonna not
And
do
yeah,
that.
we're gonna change that culture. Sorry,
Yeah,
we're gonna try to like preserve life if culture has become anti-life. Okay. Um, but the church standing on his high horse saying, condemning culture and saying, yeah, you need to sort of whatever. And that hypocrisy, it's like we are hypocrites. We are saying we're looking to Christ as our standard, and we are failing to meet that standard. And I wonder if there is a level of authenticity that needs to be sort of more visible than it would be if the barrier is I have to show up to a church on a Sunday morning to
Mhm.
see that not all these people are hypocrites. Not all these Christians
Yeah.
are hypocrites. It's like some of these people are profoundly aware of how wrecked they are and how profoundly they need Jesus.
Yeah.
But I don't see that because I have to go to a church on a Sunday morning to see that. Well, now all these churches have live stream. I don't know what you will
Yes.
see, but one of the things that I hope that people would see is that, um, again, I think that what will catch on
Mhm.
in any sort of digital culture or whatever this movement is would be a level of authenticity that's appealing to people, because I think the facade, the kayfabe, the WWE, I mean, some of that stuff is really entertaining, but
Mhm.
when your message is we're genuine, this is true, this is
Mhm.
real, this is good, this is beautiful, but
Yeah.
the backdrop is a facade, is fake, then your message, you're not, it's not convincing. The gospel that you preach and the life that you live need to be consistent,
Yeah.
right? And I don't know if that's possible online, but I wonder if that's one of those things, because you just have more people sifting through. And like I remember doing this, like I remember when, all right, this is a little bit of an embarrassing story, but whatever. If this
Oh,
goes out on the internet, it's 57 minutes in, and most people have
they
not. But when I first started learning how to do like YouTube, and when I first started a podcast, I did a different podcast, and I joined these Facebook groups, right?
yeah.
And I joined the Facebook groups because I wanted people to discover my podcast. And so I would go into these Facebook groups and I would ask these. So like, let's say I did a podcast. Let's say I did a podcast on the subject of whatever. It was a Bible story or something like that. And I
Yeah.
would say, hey, has anybody looked into this Bible story? Da 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 da. Oh, here's a link, right? And
Yeah.
so like people would call me out and say, look, you have an agenda here. You
Yeah.
just
This
want
is an
people,
honest
yeah,
discussion.
you want to, but you're not really coming out and saying, "Hey, I just want to share what I'm doing." You're
Mhm.
doing it in sort of a subversive way. And it's like, wow, there's a level of sensitivity that people have online
Mhm.
where it's like, I know you're being fake here. I know that your question
Mhm.
is actually leading to this agenda that you have. And I remember just thinking, gosh,
Yeah.
this is a smart generation of
I
people who have
know
lived
this.
online. Like I didn't like I'm an early adopter to like sort of online world, but I didn't grow up in the world of the internet. The internet came
It
to
came later.
be,
Yeah.
yeah, I was probably 9 when I
Okay.
first like jumped online really.
Mhm.
Maybe a little bit younger than that. But these people who have had iPads in their laps since they were 2 are like, "Hey man, you're full of shit."
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, "How do you know I'm full of shit? It's
Oh,
just
what?
text.
How
It's
did you
just
know?
text."
No, they knew. They knew. Well, and
Um, and
yeah.
so people are calling you out on your BS,
Mhm.
even though it seems like this should be a place where you could just fake it. You could totally make it up. It's like,
Well,
no, people aren't interested. They have a level of sensitivity that says that's fake, that's fake, that's BS.
yeah.
And of course, it's becoming more and more sophisticated. So
Yeah.
so people will, you will buy into some of these deep fakes or whatever. But I think that the church has has been limited maybe, or sort of truncated, or less mobile, less attractive to people, they're not connecting to people in the way the church should, the way Christ has designed the church to be, the light,
Mhm.
not put under a bushel, that type of thing.
Yeah.
um and maybe this is affording us the opportunity to be genuine in like a really it's the foolish things confounding the wise, because I would really think that this is the place where you could put up a bunch of BS and people would fall for it, but it just doesn't seem like the internet is shaking out that way. It seems like I mean, not to be political, but it really seems like there's a political party who does not understand this because
Uh-huh.
they keep putting out stuff where it's like, wow, that's
It
heavily
doesn't seem
edited and
true.
gross. Like it's so
Yeah,
fake, it's gross,
yeah,
you know? And then it happens on both sides, but there's
for
one where
sure.
I'm like, wow.
Wow, should have hired a better intern.
Yeah, your intern is uh yeah, anyway. So and then I do have a story that kind of goes into what I was talking about, but it seemed like you maybe had some thoughts there.
Well, the idea of having, I just honesty,
Yeah.
an honest a platform for honest communication, like wherever you can find that, that's going to breed the right kind of discussions for, well, evangelism, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so to utilize anything in an online platform, a community of people, discussing matters of faith, politics, mystery, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, if people are given the opportunity to ask honest questions and then offer honest answers or even hypotheticals,
Yeah.
then you're in the right place. I mean, like so much of like, you know, the like street evangelism,
Mm.
or just trying to share your faith. Like the obstacles are like, how do I get people to just talk with me about this stuff because they don't want to talk about it. But the internet shows people are willing to talk about a lot of things that they
Yeah.
don't want to talk to you about if you're just like cold calling
Yeah.
or knocking on doors, you know?
Wow.
And so we've skipped if you can connect with someone in a platform like this, then you've skipped kind of the hardest part of evangelism, which is just being able to talk to someone.
Hmm.
And like you're saying, if we are actually growing up with, digital natives,
Yeah.
um, then the how to talk to someone isn't that's not a barrier anymore. Like that bridge has already
Mm.
been crossed. And so you have the opportunity for these honest discussions, which
Hmm.
hopefully ultimately leads to the gospel. But
Hmm. Um, all right, so I got a story to tell.
I want to hear it.
And then I probably should I need to get my kids to a I guess it's an Awanas class or something like
Okay.
that.
Yeah, that's important. We
Yeah,
need that
those
in
are
our
important
church
things.
too.
It's like they were invited by their friends. Like, I don't wanna
Okay.
sound like I actually am, like, a
Yeah.
responsible, Christian dad, and I actually have, like, signed my kids up
Okay.
for Awanas,
Yeah.
like some do. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's a thing. Oh, thanks for friends that invited you to an Awanas." They invited them into,
So it
physical space.
used to be
Mm.
that the kids in Awana had to bring a friend in order to pass like their
Ah,
next
I think that's what it
achievement.
is. It's gotta
And
be that.
I was the only kid that wasn't in Awana, and so I got invited a lot to because I
Like,
was the
you gotta
only
find a
one that
friend.
everybody was like, "Yeah, he's been here before, but like
Still
he
counts, right?
still,
He's
right?" Yeah. I love Awana. I ended up going. Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Um
Mhm.
All right. So I was at an event hosted by Friends of Labrie Nashville.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
So Labrie Fellowship, Francis
Okay.
Schaeffer.
Sure.
There's a Friends of Labrie group here locally.
Okay.
And the subject of the conversation, which essentially there's all kinds of tables and everybody's sharing a meal together. But not everybody's, there's so many people, you can't all
Mhm.
sit at one table, right? So
Yeah.
everybody's sitting kind of different parts of the house. It's really cool. Like the homeowners that hosted it were really nice. They had, you know, dining tables set up in all kinds of nooks and crannies of their house. It was really fun. Um, and I actually ended up sitting down with one of the hosts. He was the homeowner, and the subject that we were supposed to be talking about, which is everybody sits down at the table, but there's one conversation shared at the table, no side conversations. That was like
Yeah.
one of the rules.
All right.
And the topic of conversation was the hospitality of need. And there's actually a book written by a guy who he's in a wheelchair, but he wanted to go on a trip through Europe. And in order to do it, he needed to do it with, I think, 3 of his friends. And essentially the way that they did this trip, because there's all kinds of stuff that's not wheelchair accessible for him. And he's in like a big wheelchair. Like he can't roll the wheels. He's got to use
Yeah.
the controller. And so there's just all kinds of places that are not accessible to him. So they got a rig, like a backpack, where he could sit with them. They could carry him and and move him, go to all these
Mhm.
different places. And it created some friction, right? Because there were times when they were moving a lot slower than the other tourists around them. And
Yeah.
and they had to ask those other tourists to wait, like just let
Yeah.
us, particularly like in some of the rockier places where a slip and fall would have been really really bad. They had to really take their time. um and so he was telling a story of one time they were trying to get back to the boats. They were going down this like steep stairway. They were on this island, and the boats were like leaving. They're like, guys, we got to go. And they're like, sorry, we literally can't go any faster than this. Like, this is how fast we have to go. And all the people were behind them. It's just this one little
Oh,
narrow stairway. So
yeah.
all the people behind them. And it
Real
took them a significant amount of time. But in that time, the boat captains, negotiated the fact that they could stay, they could wait. So essentially, they sacrificed for these people. Then
Yeah.
everybody behind them sort of sacrificed. But what happened was conversation, right? Because everybody, it's like, where else are we going to go? We got to wait for this guy to get down the stairs, and we're
Yeah.
all backed up. So how's your day?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
this sort of natural human thing, sort of spontaneously
Mhm.
generated out of what would have normally been a bunch of pockets of individuals just
Mhm.
looking at the sights and not really talking to each other. Now they had,
They form a
because of
community of
because of how
suffering
slow he had to
people.
go, they all backed up behind him, and they all kind of
Yeah.
became one group.
Yeah.
And um and so it was just sort of like, yeah, like a beautiful but also hard testimony to share. But often that God does things, and if and God does things out of our need, because of our need. Um and 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 yet we sort of go to church acting like we have it all together. We go to church acting like we don't have a need. Kind of to your point of street evangelism. It's like, honestly, people don't want to share what they really should be sharing. People don't want to confess, like,
No.
yeah,
No.
actually, I grew up as a Christian and my dad was a pastor, and he was like such a hypocrite, and he would always like yell at us, and he was abusive and blah blah. And so yeah, man, I'm not interested in your church. I'm not interested in
Right.
Christianity. People don't want to have a cold call where they have to that has to is threatening to come out, right? People don't want to to be the person who has a need. Um and some of us don't have the physical needs that this particular person
Right.
had, but so often we have these mental and emotional needs, spiritual needs that go unaddressed, because it's like, well, I'm a fairly functional human being, and I can hold down a job, and I can kind of hold down a relationship, blah blah blah. So as I was sitting down at the table after this guy's testimony, one of the guys at the table was just, yeah, like he just had this moment of honesty where, though he'd been in church for a really long time, he just was like, man, I don't really like have any friends at church. Like, I don't really know any of the
That
people that
honest
go to my
moment. Yeah.
church. Like,
Mhm.
because, and part of it is when I go to church, I don't see a lot of people in need.
Hmm.
And it makes me self-conscious
Mhm.
because I'm aware of my need. Like, I have a need, like, I'm not fully functional. Like,
I don't want
I'm
to be the first one
broken.
to say,
Yeah,
know what
like,
everyone's thinking, which is that I need help. Yeah.
I need help, but
Yeah.
none of these people look like they need help, and none of these people are saying that they need help. These people look like they got this Jesus thing figured out. They look like they're doing the Jesus thing right,
Mhm.
and I'm not. And so this must not be my people. Um and I think that, if I'm trying to conceptualize what the communion of the saints looks like, it sort of looks more like that conversation around the dinner table talking about the hospitality of need.
Yeah.
It looks a little bit more like three friends backpacking
Will
their
look like
handicapped
suffer
friend
together.
across the
Yeah.
across Europe.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking of the opportunity that those 3 friends had because they had a bold friend who said, "Help me." Like, they gotta go to Europe and backpack. That's cool in itself.
Right.
But they wouldn't be unable to do that had that guy either figured out how to do it by himself
Yeah.
or realize he can't do it by himself, therefore he can't do it at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, the
And for him to just be like, "Hey guys, I want to go on a backpacking trip through Europe."
I'm the backpack.
I'm the
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I think this is an interesting thing for you to kinda consider. What does suffering together look like in these kind of platforms? Because I do think there's an element of the communion of the saints, which requires us just bear
Yeah.
one another's burdens and to mourn with those who mourn. Um, and yeah, I think there's going to be plenty of people now in this brave new world that are going to be more comfortable
Mhm.
actually discussing their needs and their suffering in these kinds of uh, venues.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, I would just figured I
Yeah,
would
this is
find
the
this.
rabbit room. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Anyway,
saw
so
the right
so
that's out.
the Friends of Labrie Nashville are somewhat connected to the Rabbit Room, but
Okay. 'Cause they're in Nashville too, right? They're right
yeah.
is Rabbit Room right outside Nashville? Yeah.
So anyway, that there it is. At least that's their description
Okay.
of it. Kevin Chandler and Tommy Shelton for anybody that's
Totality of need.
interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah. It looks like, I mean, it's so funny, right? I do feel, and I've said this to students, I've said this even during my time in YWAM, where um, it's like we want the empty tomb without the without the cross. We want the resurrection without the
Oh, yeah.
death.
Yeah, yeah,
We
sure.
preach the gospel is two-fisted. It's
Mhm.
death and new life. But we talk about the new life and we don't talk. It's like Jesus did say, pick up your cross and follow me. Blessed are the poor. Even Paul says, I want to know Christ, the power of his resurrection. And everybody goes, yes and amen.
Mhm.
And the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, the fellowship
Right.
of sharing in his sufferings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's communion.
And so, yeah, like when you think about,
Mm.
to your point about Stephen Lawson, it's like that hurts.
Mhm. Right.
Why? Because there's some connection that I have to this person
Yeah.
and the work that God is doing in and through him and will still, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, yeah.
because we are people who believe in a gospel of restoration.
Mhm.
This is something that Warren Gage pointed out
Yeah.
at Knox, because there was a scandal at
Mhm.
that church.
Yeah. Yeah. At
It's
the
like,
same time as the Calvary Chapel next door had
oh,
their own the biggest Calvary Chapel in the States. It used to be Calvary. Yeah. Yeah. The next door neighbor pastors both fell at the same time.
dang.
Yeah.
Well, and
'Cause
which
yeah.
is so it's like,
Yeah.
but it's like, in what world is someone like Stephen Lawson lost? He's not. Like, the gospel
Never.
is a gospel of restoration.
Right.
Like, are you ever gonna is he gonna hold the same office? Like, to your point,
Mhm.
yeah, probably not, you
No.
know?
But the distinction that's made between the office and ministry in general is really helpful and important.
Yeah.
We have the same we wanna show mercy to Russel Brand and Steve Lawson both
Yeah.
because both of them can be used in unique ways, and of course, we want the mercy of God to be on both of them.
In
Um,
in a
yeah.
in a world in a world of communion of the saints where we're sharing the hospitality of need,
Mhm.
it sort of breaks down these barriers. Now, in a world of preaching of the word, preaching of the word, preaching of the word, which is Steve Lawson's world,
Right.
um, doesn't that seem like it does divide us? In a way, like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
fully think that the preaching of the word is like a sacred thing. Like, I
Yeah.
do think that it
Yeah.
is, and I think I try to hold that, um, I try to hold a high view
Yeah.
of the preaching of the word, but oftentimes what will happen is it will divide people into camps.
Mhm.
"Ah, you preach that, and I preach this.
Yeah.
You think that, and I think this."
Yeah.
And when the
Yeah.
preaching of the word is emphasized, it does seem much easier to kind of divide into camps based
Mm.
off of sort of what we sort of, I don't want to say ideologically believe, but kind of what we ideologically
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah.
Um, Man,
Yeah.
when we come into worship together because we're all broken people, it's like I was listening to Jonathan Pajot and Ben Shapiro have a discussion. Jonathan Pajot is an Orthodox Christian. Ben
Right.
Shapiro is a Jew.
Mhm.
And and Ben Shapiro made a statement that Cain repented and then built a city. And I want and
Okay.
Jonathan Pajot doesn't address that. He doesn't say, "Well, does Cain really repent?"
Mhm.
'Cause that I would have been, like, stuck on that. I would have been like, "Well,
Yeah.
how do you get Cain repenting?" He builds a city in disobedience to God who called him out into the wilderness. He said, "Go. No,
Mhm.
you'll be fine.
Yeah.
I put a mark on you. You're gonna be fine." Cain builds a city because he's scared to trust in Yahweh in that moment.
Yeah.
But that's me. That's my this is, excuse me.
Mhm.
This is the preaching of the word. Wait, hold
Yeah, yeah.
on. You know,
The
now you're in
Bible
that camp and
story
I'm in this
about
camp.
it. Yeah.
What's that?
I said, "What's the Bible story about it?"
Right, right.
Like, that's our biggest question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder, I mean, and again, it's not that we're doing away with the preaching of the
No.
word. It's just that how does this communion of the saints idea, or even to your point about the Eucharist,
Yeah.
because I think in a way to me, even the liturgy, all that stuff, it's sort of like wrapped into this kind of this attempt to understand my own Christianity,
Yeah.
but also realizing that there are elements of it that are
It
mysterious to
can be
me.
mysterious, yeah. Yeah, Lewis has the famous line in Letters to Malcolm where he's talking about the Eucharist, and he's like, "We have to remember the command is take and eat, not take and understand."
Hmm.
Um, and I obviously that is necessarily true about the Eucharist, which is mysterious and, raises questions, but I think it's true of the way we receive the word as well,
Yeah.
you know? I mean, there's real presence in the preaching of the word too. It's the word of God. He's speaking to his church, and we take it and we eat it, and sometimes it's sweet in our mouth and bitter in our stomach. Um,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
yeah, but this issue of, like, preaching can cause division. It can, and it's always interesting because, like, in pastoral ministry, like, there's a loneliness there, right?
Hmm.
There's a loneliness that just comes that pastors will get. And there's pastors of other churches that I'm very close with, very good friends with, and there's people at our churches that wouldn't go to the other one's church because of
Hmm.
what is taught there,
Right.
because it's like, well, they teach what we don't believe. Like,
Right.
we believe this and they believe that. And I'm like having coffee with their pastor,
Right. Right. Right.
and like we're praying together, and like the communion of the saints is happening,
Hmm.
and like we love each other. And then we scratch our heads and be like, like, would our people in our churches not approve of this coffee time?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And you see that, like, division happened somewhere, and it was not our intent
Right.
for sure. But
Right.
yeah,
But I think we used to burn heretics. So it's like, yeah, nobody wants to be a
that's
heretic,
true.
but maybe we're
Yeah.
taking this too seriously. It's like we're all a little heretical, right? I mean,
Like a
none of us has this
Greek too, I think.
fully formed like so let's maybe pump the brakes. We're not burning people anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe let's not even like worry so much that like there's a little bit of heresy in
Uh-huh.
our orthodoxy maybe.
Yeah.
Um well and I think that's, and maybe the more we do that, maybe the more we share, time and space and coffee and prayer
Mm.
with people who might even preach the word slightly different. Again, you can learn from him, he can learn from you. I assume, like, I don't agree. Like, in a way, none of us agree on everything.
Well, I tell my people this, I'm like, I don't agree with everything the pastor at our church teaches, and it's me.
Yeah.
Like,
It's like, I
I
don't agree with everything I read in the Bible,
yeah,
and I gotta
right.
work on
I
that,
gotta
you know?
assume I'm the wrong one, but it doesn't mean yeah, I don't have to like all this stuff. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
real.
well, we should be taking um, we shouldn't what is Lewis says this in The Four Loves, right? It's like, we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously, but we should take ourselves with the right kind of seriousness, you know?
Okay,
Like,
that's good. Yeah.
something like that. I've probably botched the quote, but it's like, yeah, this is serious business, which is why we're laughing about it,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is why we can sort of share a cup of coffee. It's the foolish things of the world that confound the wise. It's like the internet, the place where we thought it would sort of destroy humanity, is somehow mysteriously
Mhm.
and maybe providentially bringing
Yeah.
humanity together. You know, like, it's just
Yeah.
it's David using Goliath's own sword to
Yeah.
chop off the head of the giant, right?
Plundering
It's
the Egyptians.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All
It's
their stuff.
Jesus dying to then undermine death. It's the using the tools of the enemy to overthrow the enemy. You know, in a lot of ways, I think.
Mhm.
So,
Those are
um, okay, I'm just gonna end it there,
okay.
and then you and
All
I
right.
can
Feel
talk
feel
more.
free to
We
kick
can talk
me.
more sort of on the back end, and then
Okay.
I gotta go drop off the kids at Awanas.
That's right.